But he changed them out with these ones, and he said these should help. I'm not sure if that does, but I don't know if I'm getting sounds like I'm getting a tiny bit of a hum here. On those ones seem to be okay. It seems to be like this one mainly, but you might try them out.
Testing. Okay, so I'm just talking right now. Oh, yes. Yeah. Testing. 5, 4, 3, 2. Chairman's microphone. Cool. Ranking member. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Testing. Witness microphone. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Q&A, make sure you turn it on and off when you're not, yeah, because it picks up everything. So
Okay.
if you're, getting it counts or whatever, it might inadvertently pick up something you don't want it to.
Gotcha.
So yeah, that's pretty
All
much
right.
it. Water here for you.
Awesome.
You don't have to get that close because I think you can hear a little bit that it's picking up even me
Yeah.
standing here. So.
Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Test 1. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4.
Well, good morning, everyone. A quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. I'd like to begin by welcoming our witnesses. Some of you have traveled from across the country, including one from my home state of Alabama, Roll Tide, to be here today. Welcome and thank you for joining us. As I said at our first subcommittee hearing of the 115th Congress, the rules and regulations surrounding the Fair Labor Standards Act are simply outdated. We live in the 21st century, yet many of the rules governing America's workplaces were designed by those who lived during the Great Depression. It goes without saying that a lot has changed since then. Millennials now represent the majority of the workforce. Hard for me to believe, but that's true. In nearly half of two-parent households, both mom and dad work full-time. That's up from roughly 30% in 1970. Meanwhile, technological advances continue to rapidly change the very nature of how we work and stay connected to work. As a result, men and women today face a different set of challenges when it comes to balancing the demands of their professional lives and their personal lives. There simply aren't enough hours in the day. I hear that a lot from people. It's something I hear so often as I talk to neighbors and families in my district. As our colleague, Representative Martha Roby, once put it, quote, "We can't legislate another hour in the day," close quote. That's true, but we can do our part to ensure the federal government isn't making life more difficult for workers and their families. That's why Representative Roby introduced the Working Families Flexibility Act. This common sense proposal would improve the quality of life of many hardworking men and women by removing outdated federal restrictions imposed solely on the private sector. You see, for decades, public sector employers have been able to offer workers the choice between paid time off and cash wages for working overtime. That's because in 1985, Congress amended the Fair Labor Standards Act to give public sector employees greater flexibility. In fact, in a report filed by this very committee more than 30 years ago, our Democrat colleagues wrote that this change in the law recognized, quote, "the mutual benefits," close quote, "of comp time for state and local governments and their employees." The Democrat committee report even refers to the, quote, "freedom and flexibility," close quote, comp time would offer public sector workers. But under federal law, it's still illegal to extend the same benefits to private sector employees who are eligible for overtime pay. This isn't right, and this isn't fair. Private sector workers should be afforded the same freedom to do what's best for themselves and their families. For many Americans working paycheck to paycheck, earning some additional income is the choice that's best for them. But the federal government shouldn't assume that that's the best choice for everyone. Many individuals would welcome the opportunity to put in a few extra hours if it meant having more paid time off to catch a child's baseball game or a dance recital. Others are in desperate need of greater flexibility to care for an aging relative, juggle work and parenting while a spouse is deployed overseas, or complete another semester of college while working full-time. Something Mr. Takano and I have talked a lot about, helping people that are trying to go back to school. Every worker has a different story, but they all deserve the choice between more time and more money in the bank. They all deserve to choose the best option that meets their personal needs. Unfortunately, union leaders and special interest groups have tried desperately over the years to deny workers the freedom to make their choice. They've used no shortage of false and misleading rhetoric in the process, so allow me to briefly explain what this bill actually does. This bill preserves the 40-hour work week and existing overtime protections. Say it again. This bill preserves the 40-hour work week and existing overtime protections. For workers who elect to receive paid time off, their leave would accrue at the same rate, time and a half, as wages. The bill includes strong protections to ensure the use of comp time is completely voluntary. Workers can switch back to receiving cash wages whenever they choose, and they are allowed to cash out their comp time for any reason at any time. Additionally, it is up to the employee to decide when to use his or her time off, so long as reasonable notice is provided and the request is not overly disruptive. This is the same common sense standard that exists in the public sector, and I suspect it's the same standard that is implied in most of our congressional offices. This bill also includes important protections to prevent employers from intimidating or coercing employees into receiving paid leave in lieu of cash wages, and the Department of Labor would have full authority to enforce those protections. This legislation is ultimately about freedom, choice, and fairness. An antiquated federal law shouldn't limit the ability of private sector employees to better balance work and family. Democrats and Republicans came together more than 30 years ago to amend the law to provide more choices for public sector workers, and it's time we did the same for workers in the private sector. This isn't a new or radical idea either. In fact, President Bill Clinton had his own comp time proposal during his presidency. I want to thank Representative Roby for leading this effort. Improving workplace flexibility is one step we can take to make a positive difference in the lives of American families. And it doesn't require another government program, another federal mandate, or onerous regulations that burden small businesses. That is why I support the Working Families Flexibility Act, and I urge all of my colleagues to do the same. I look forward to our discussion today, and I will now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Takano, for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Chairman Byrne. With all due respect, H.R. 1180 really should be renamed the Betrayal of Working Families Act. It creates new rights for employers to withhold workers' hard-earned overtime pay, but really, no new rights for employees. Right now, an employee who takes time off from work can use her overtime pay to cover her expenses while she's out. She can put her overtime pay in the bank where it will earn interest and take time off from work later, using that paycheck plus the interest to cover her expenses. It's that simple. Nothing is as fungible or as convenient as cash. The Betrayal of Working Families Act makes things much more complicated. If, instead of getting overtime pay, she accepts her employer's offer of comp time, she won't get a paycheck for her overtime. She'll get an IOU. And many workers will feel compelled to accept comp time given the power differential between non-union employees and their employers. By accepting comp time, she would forfeit her overtime pay and the interest she would have earned if she put that paycheck in the bank. Instead of paying her for the overtime when she earned it at some point in the future, which could be more than a year later, her employer may let her take comp time, returning her withheld wages minus any interest the employer earned while holding on to her paycheck. She has essentially given her employer an interest-free loan repayable only when the employer decides when it's convenient, not when she needs the money or the time off from work. Now, I have a slide here that shows how this could play out across a company. Now, Acme Incorporated, a hypothetical company, could get 160 free comp time hours from each of its 200,000 FLSA-covered employees at $7.25 an hour from each employee. Now, that's $232 million Acme Incorporated wouldn't have to pay its workers for about a year after they earned it. To get an equivalent loan from a bank, Acme Incorporated would have to pay roughly 6% interest. Now, Acme Incorporated saves $14 million by relying on comp time to take out an interest-free loan from its employees instead. Now, as this example illustrates, the Betrayal of Working Families Act is simply another attempt by congressional Republicans to give every advantage to corporations and special interests and take from families who have the least to spare. Since January, President Trump and congressional Republicans have broken promise after promise to working people. President Trump said in his inaugural address, quote, "To all Americans in every city near and far, small and large, from mountain to mountain and from ocean to ocean, hear these words. You will never be ignored again. Your voice, your hopes, and your dreams will define our American destiny," end quote. Now, this could not be further from the truth. The majority's plan to repeal the ACA has threatened 24 million Americans' access to health care. Their attack on rules to protect retirement security has undercut millions of Americans' ability to save for old age. And they fought the overtime rule, which would give millions of hardworking Americans a raise. Now, up next, President Trump wants tax breaks for the wealthy and to gut programs like workforce training that would help people get good-paying jobs. Instead of rigging the economy in favor of the rich and powerful, it's time to rewrite the rules to make the economy work for everyday Americans. Hardworking Americans made our nation's productivity rise by more than 70% over the past 4 decades. And yet, it's CEOs' pay that has risen by nearly 1,000% during that same period, while workers' wages barely grow. Now, special interests don't need more leverage and power. It's hard-working Americans' turn to finally get a break. Instead of bringing up legislation that diminishes people's ability to provide for and care for their families, this committee should bring up legislation that strengthens the Fair Labor Standards Act by raising the minimum wage, restoring the overtime salary threshold, ensuring equal pay, providing truly flexible and predictable schedules and paid leave, as well as strengthening workers' ability to bargain for a better life. These solutions are clear, and unfortunately, H.R. 1180 is not among them. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, all subcommittee members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow statements, questions for the records, and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted in the official hearing record. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's witnesses. Ms. Leslie Christ serves as Chief Resource Officer at Wellstone Behavioral Health in Huntsville, Alabama. Ms. Crystal Frey is Vice President of Human Resources at Continental Realty Corporation of Baltimore, Maryland, and is testifying on behalf of the Society for Human Resource Management, or SHRM. Ms. Vicki Shabo is Vice President at the National Partnership for Women and Families here in Washington, D.C., and Mr. Leonard Court is a Director at Crowe and Dunleavy in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and is testifying on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I will now ask our witnesses to raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Before I recognize you to provide your testimony, let me explain our lighting system. You each will have 5 minutes to present your testimony. When you begin, the light in front of you will turn green. When 1 minute is left, the light will turn yellow. When your time has expired, the light will turn red. At that point, I ask you to wrap up your remarks as best as you are able. After you have testified, members will each have 5 minutes to ask questions. Now, I'm not real heavy with the gavel, so I'm not going to, right at 5 minutes, just wrap you right down. But that is the time to really kind of wrap it up. And so if you would, please try to keep as close to that as you can. We clear on that? Okay. All right, let's start with our first witness. That will be you, Ms. Christ.
Good morning, Chairman Byrne, Ranking Member Takano, and members of committee. It's an honor to be here with you today to discuss comp time. I serve as a Chief Resource Officer at Wellstone Behavioral Health, a public nonprofit community mental health center in Huntsville, Alabama, where I've worked for the past 18 years. Prior to my HR career, I proudly served our country for 24 years, including service in Operation Iraqi Freedom. At Wellstone, we strive to restore hope and healthy living to our clients. To fulfill this mission, our 300 employees provide services to patients with serious emotional disturbances and mental illnesses. In 2016, our dedicated employees served 9,000 clients, logging nearly 200,000 service hours. As a healthcare facility, we are not only dedicated to patient care, but we're also committed to the well-being of our employees. We offer many programs and benefits, including generous paid leave and flexible work options, to support our employees' diverse work-life needs. Our benefits, which are outlined in greater detail in my written statement, have helped us achieve several awards and are critical to our employee and family-friendly culture. Mr. Chairman, because our employees provide critical mental health services to members of our community during times of crisis, I personally work with many employees to address their own specific work-life needs, which is why I'm here today. I believe many of my employees would benefit from us having the choice of comp time, especially since 63% of our workforce are non-exempt and women account for 72% of our total workforce. Allow me to give you 3 recent examples of where I believe comp time would have been helpful to Wellstone employees. Just after starting at Wellstone, one of our clerical staff members learned she was pregnant, but not yet eligible for paid leave under our short-term disability plan. While working on a major project, she incurred significant overtime and asked if we could just waive the overtime and credit her that time so she could take off and receive pay during her maternity leave. It was difficult telling this single mom-to-be that this arrangement was not an option under the current law. My son, he's an on-call Wellstone employee in our acute care setting, and he often earns overtime pay. Like any other 18-year-old living at home, he tends to spend his overtime pay when he earns it. But if he were allowed to choose comp time, he's told me he would rather take the comp time to have a leave savings plan where he could build a bank of leave, and if he needed to use the leave, he could use it, or he could get a lump sum payout at the end of the year. Many employees work side by side with the Huntsville Police Department at my organization, who you know benefit from receiving overtime pay or comp time. It is not uncommon for the officers to discuss their comp time arrangements with my employees, who then come to me on a regular basis asking why we don't offer comp time as an option for staff members. These employees believe it's Wellstone denying them of this option until I explain it's the federal law, the Fair Labor Standards Act to be exact, that prohibits comp time for the private sector, yet allows it for the public sector. Mr. Chairman, these are just a few examples that demonstrate Wellstone's interest in comp time. There have been many others, and I expect there'll be more in the future, as our employees seek choices in navigating their work-life obligations. That's why I strongly support H.R. 1180, the Working Families Flexibility Act, introduced by my home state representative, Martha Roby, because this bill would give both employers and employees choices. Under the legislation, employers decide whether they even offer the comp time arrangement. And if an employer does offer it, each employee can decide whether to participate in the comp time program, and we know comp time works. After all, it's been a success in the public sector for decades. Updating FLSA to give all employers and employees this option, to me, frankly, is a no-brainer. After all, Mr. Chairman, employers like Wellstone are always looking for ways to assist employees in their work-life needs, to drive recruitment and retention and engagement. Since no two workplaces are the same, it is important for employers to have many opportunities and options as possible to support the needs unique to their workforce and their employees. Therefore, I hope Congress will advance this reasonable legislation, and I thank you for all this opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Good morning, Chairman Byrne, Ranking Member Takano, and members of the committee. I am Crystal Frey, the Vice President of Human Resources at Continental Realty Corporation, or CRC, located in Baltimore, Maryland. I appear before you today on behalf of the Society for Human Resource Management, or SHRM, of which I have been a member for 21 years. I appreciate the opportunity to provide input into H.R. 1180, the Working Families Flexibility Act, a bill to allow private sector employers the opportunity to provide paid leave for overtime hours worked. Mr. Chairman, as you know, comp time has been an option for non-exempt employees in the public sector for more than 3 decades. So the concept of giving employees the choice to select paid time off for overtime hours worked is nothing new. The FLSA was enacted in the 1930s, and it reflects the realities of the industrial workplace, not the workplace of the 21st century. It's time to amend this outdated statute to extend the benefit to the private sector. The increased diversity and complexity of the 21st century is driving the need for more workplace flexibility, including paid leave and flexible work options. 56% of parents struggle to balance work and family responsibilities. 50% of fathers say they spend too little time with their children, and 40% of mothers say they always feel rushed. Because employees are juggling more responsibilities between work and home, public policy should encourage or allow employers to offer voluntary workplace flexibility, options that would help employees meet their work-life obligations. That's why I'm pleased to join SHRM in supporting H.R. 1180. This bill would amend the FLSA to permit the private sector to offer employees the voluntary choice of taking overtime and cash payments, as they do today, or in the form of paid time off from work. Paid time off would accrue at a rate of 1.5 hours for each hour of overtime worked, allowing employees to accrue up to 160 hours of comp time per year. An employer, however, could choose to cash out the comp time after 80 hours after providing the employee with 30 days written notice, and all comp time would have to cash out at year's end. The bill also includes several important employee protections. In the ever-changing real estate industry, offering workplace flexibility is key to recruiting and retaining top talent. This is especially true in my company, which competes for talent in the Washington, D.C. metro area, where many federal workers can use comp time. CRC is committed to the success of our employees at work and at home, which is why we have a retention rate of over 80% and our average tenure is 7 years of employment. CRC has received numerous awards, which speaks to our culture, but more importantly, they demonstrate our commitment to our employees. CRC is invested in our workforce and is always looking for additional opportunities to provide employees with flexibility. Many CRC employees have inquired about comp time, and I can tell you it's incredibly difficult to explain to employees why they can't choose for themselves whether to take overtime pay or paid time off for hours worked over 40 in a week. Many CRC employees would benefit from having the option of comp time, particularly those who work at our commercial properties. Often these employees work overtime to respond to situations created by inclement weather or maintenance-related issues. The ability to bank paid time off would give these employees a sense of reassurance, knowing they could take time off when they need it most and receive pay. Mr. Chairman, all the workplace flexibility practices outlined in my written statement are voluntary. We don't have to offer these benefits, but we do because they work well for our employees and help us attract and retain the best people. The choice of offering comp time arrangements to employees would provide us with another workplace flexibility tool to support our employees and their diverse needs. That's why H.R. 1180's voluntary approach to comp time for employers and employees is so important. If enacted, this bill would give employers the option of offering a comp time program and employees the choice of whether to participate in a comp time arrangement. SHRM strongly supports comp time as outlined in H.R. 1180. Because it meets our core workplace flexibility principles, that for flexibility to be effective, it must work for the employers and the employees. While advancing this bill is a step in the right direction, SHRM also welcomes a broader conversation on additional ways that public policy can facilitate greater voluntary adoption of workplace flexibility programs. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I'm Vicki Szabo, Vice President at the National Partnership for Women and Families, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization here in Washington, D.C. For more than 45 years, we have fought for every major federal policy advance that has helped women and families. It's been said here many times, most of us hold jobs, both women and men, in order to support ourselves and our families. Most of us also provide care to loved ones. 70% of children live in households where all parents work. Tens of millions of people provide unpaid care to older adults and their families each year and hold paying jobs at the same time. In short, work-family challenges connect us all, but workplace policies too often fall short by failing to provide fair wages, predictable schedules, and paid time to recover from illness and care for our loved ones. The employees at Ms. Christ's company and Ms. Fry's are quite lucky compared to millions of workers across the country who don't have even these benefits that you all provide, and I'm so grateful that you do. But even SHRM's own research, released earlier last month, shows that practices are not getting better for most workers in this country. America's working people haven't reaped the benefits of a growing economy. Over the past 4 decades, workforce productivity has increased by more than 70%, while hourly compensation has increased by just about 11%. This has meant more stress and less opportunity for workers across the country in rural areas, in small towns, and in big cities alike. And it's meant less predictability, less security, and less independence for those families now and in the future. This isn't the America that your constituents or any of us deserve. There's no question that lawmakers must update our workplace policies to meet the needs of 21st century families. But H.R. 1180 would be a giant step in the wrong direction. Instead of investing in and empowering people with higher wages, this so-called flexibility bill offers forced choices and false promises. Instead of building on the success of state and local policies and leading private sector practices in terms of time to care, it gives workers a pay cut without the guarantee of time off when they need it most. It sets up a false dichotomy between time and money when people urgently need both. The FLSA allows both, and research shows that employers benefit from both. Let me briefly outline 5 key problems. First, 1180 purports to require an agreement by an employee to accept comp time, but the employees I referenced in my opening statement, Susanna, who's a clerical worker with 3 children and an elderly mother and an unpredictable schedule, Janice, a nurse who's seen the value of her wages decline dramatically, and Allison, who says that overtime pay means the difference between meatloaf for supper instead of rice and beans. These women could easily feel obligated to agree to comp time, even though money would be more valuable. Because for them, they would fear that refusing comp time, even if it's supposed to be voluntary, could mean fewer hours, subpar shifts, and the loss of being offered overtime opportunities in the future. It would also mean for them greater scheduling instability, higher childcare expenses, and lower wages in the short term. Second, this bill should be called the Employer Flexibility Act because it makes it cheaper, again in the short term, for employers to provide comp time than to pay overtime wages. They'll have every reason to hire fewer people, relying on them to work more hours, which means more time away from their families, with the promise of future comp time. And as you well know, you can't pay the rent or buy groceries with comp time. Third, it would provide an interest-free loan to employers by permitting them to defer payment for as long as 13 months. Fourth, it would give employers, not employees, the flexibility to decide when and even if comp time can be used or offered, and then to decide whether to cash it out, tossing employees well-constructed plans to use their accrued comp time to the curb. And finally, and fifth, it offers no remedy to workers when employers deny a request to use comp time, except to ask that the time be cashed out, and even then, the employer need not provide those valuable wages for another 30 days. Experiences with comp time in the public sector illustrate these challenges all too clearly. There's a lot of case law on this. And let's not pretend that benevolence motivated that public sector use of comp time. It was a cost savings measure. We urge you to reject 1180. At a time when the nation urgently needs workplaces that are more fair and family friendly, this bill is an empty promise, a cruel hoax that would take the country in the wrong direction. Instead, working families need a suite of policies. And let me tell you about a few. First, the Healthy Families Act, which makes paid sick days available to millions of workers and builds on laws in 7 states and 32 localities. The Family Act, which would create a national paid family and medical leave fund modeled on successful, responsible, and self-sustaining programs in California, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and soon New York and DC. Expanded access to the FMLA, a gradual increase in the minimum wage to $15 and the elimination of the tipped minimum wage, the Paycheck Fairness Act to help close the gender-based wage gap, which, by the way, in 1 year could pay for an entire course of community college for a woman or her child. The Schedules That Work Act to encourage fairer and more predictable schedules. The nation needs these advances. America's people across region and political views support these advances, and businesses do too, even smaller businesses. There's data on this. So thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. I apologize for going over my time, but look forward to answering your questions.
Honored to appear before the committee on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to discuss H.R. 1180, the Working Families Flexibility Act of 2017. As you know, the U.S. Chamber is the world's largest business federation. My firm, Crowell & Dunlevy, in Oklahoma City, is a longtime member of the Chamber, and I chair the Chamber's Wage, Hour, and Leave Subcommittee. I want to talk to you today about the Workforce Flexibility Act because it presents options for the employees. The bill would harmonize for the private sector employees the same benefits that have been available for public sector employees, including some of your own staff since 1985. The bill has been carefully drafted to ensure that employees are given the choice of whether to participate in the program, how long they want to participate in the program, when they seek the option to cash out in the program, and to give them protections against the kind of hypothetical force or coercion that has been discussed earlier today. Our prior witnesses from SHRM have talked to you about the benefits of the Act, and of course this is not the first time this Act has been discussed before the committee or this concept, so I want to talk to you about some of the arguments then that are being advanced against the Act. My paper has a more extensive discussion of these, so I want to limit my remarks to 3 or 4 specific points. First, opponents of the bill try to claim that it will undermine the protection for low-wage workers because employers will coerce employees into taking comp time, and we've already heard comments to that effect this morning. Let's be clear, the decision to participate in the program and the decision of whether or not to take this comp time is a voluntary decision based upon the employee's choice. In Section E4 of the bill, there is protection that prohibits an employer from intimidating, threatening, or coercing an employee in terms of whether they participate in this program and when they decide to voluntarily take its benefits. Second, a variation of that is that the bill will weaken protections for Americans by reducing the cost of overtime. Now, this argument in many respects assumes that this is not paid leave. In fact, not only will you have to pay as an employer the same cost that you would as if you had paid the overtime during the pay period, but you could very well be paying more because the Act requires that when the overtime is cashed in, it is cashed in at the higher hourly rate. So taking the hypothetical that was given earlier, if I get comp time in January at $7.25, but I get a pay raise in July to $9, my comp time, if I cash it out after that point in time or at the end of the year, is going to be paid at the $9 rate, not the $7.25. So in fact, it could cost employers more, not less, under this program. Third, opponents claim that too much control is given to the employer in this regard. I think that ignores the clear wording of the bill. The use of comp time, the ability to cash it in, is dependent upon only 2 things. 1, that the employee give reasonable notice to the employer, and 2, that comp time that's going to be taken will not unduly disrupt the business operation. Now, this is not a hypothetical standard. We have this standard already for public employees. We have 20 years of case law showing that this standard is a difficult standard for the employer to prove in court and to meet. Fourth, there's the unfounded argument that the bill is, that the employer could refuse to hire individuals if they will not agree to comp time. The provisions of the bill simply do not allow that. They have the same protection as covers federal employees in the use of flex time, and in fact, to even be eligible, you must have worked 1,000 hours for that employer within the previous 12 months. Last and certainly not least, the opponents of the bill say that employers may force employees to cash out comp time against their will. The protections of the bill clearly do not allow that. The employer can require an individual to cash out only comp time over 80 hours, which is a better protection that is given to those in the public sector. And the employee, on the other hand, can request to cash out comp time only within a 30-day notice. So let me, if I quickly can, then apply these rules to the hypothetical that's been given. A company has has 200,000 covered employees who are opting into the program. That would seem to indicate they want to be into that program because it is their choice, not the employer's. Over the course of the year, not one of them chooses to take the cash instead of the comp time. Again, that would seem to indicate that they are exactly want the benefit that has been given. And last and certainly not least, it can, as I indicated to you, increase the cost to the employer because several of those 200,000 employees would probably have been given pay raises during the course of that year. It is time to bring the private sector on a footing that is equal to the public sector, to harmonize the benefits. Therefore, on behalf of the U.S. Chamber and employers everywhere, we urge you to pass this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Court. And now we get to the part of the hearing where we get to ask questions. I will call on myself for the first question. Ms. Chris, you mentioned your experience working for the state of Alabama where a comp time policy was in place. You also know that many of your employees work closely with police officers who are able to choose comp time instead of overtime pay. As an HR professional with a nonprofit community mental health center, do you believe your employees would benefit from the option of choosing comp time in the same way state and local government employees have benefited from the comp time option?
Mr. Chairman, 100% yes. They do work. I did work at Department of Industrial Relations, and also we do work closely with the mental health, with the Huntsville Police Department. The way we operate are 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We do have opportunities or situations that crisis occur, and our employees are there to do the job, to help our community. And so thereby being able to choose an option to take time off later if they happen to have overtime that week would benefit them, but they would have that choice. And I believe that's why I'm a proponent, because I know our employees would like that choice.
Thank you. Mr. Court, under the bill, an employer would only be permitted to deny an employee's request to use accrued comp time if its use would, quote, unduly disrupt, close quote, the business operations. There are some who have suggested this would allow employers total control over scheduling when comp time can be taken. Could you elaborate on whether or not that's an accurate characterization of the bill's language?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that to be a very inaccurate characterization. We have over 20 years of legal precedent under cases in the public sector which use exactly that same standard. The burden of proof is on the employer. The courts have consistently held that financial cost alone is not enough to meet that standard. For instance, if I want to refuse your ability to take comp time because it's going to cost me more to bring in another person and pay them overtime, the courts have consistently held that does not meet the standard. So there is a clear protection there for employees. It's a standard that's used and has been used for 20 years in the public sector. I have every reason to believe it can work in the private sector also.
Thank you. Ms. Frey, your written testimony discusses the role public policy can play in advancing the adoption of workplace flexibility. The bill we're discussing today is certainly one of those options, and I thank you for conveying SHRM's strong support for H.R. 1180. What other policies could, as you note in your written testimony, accommodate the increased diversity and complexity within the American workforce?
Thank you, Chairman. Certainly, comp time would be a step in the right direction, but we believe that policies that would broaden the capability of employers to expand and encourage them to expand, paid leave options as well as workplace flexibility would be something that we would want to dialogue on, and certainly something we would want to work with this subcommittee on. Thank you.
Ms. Szabo, I was listening to your testimony, and you alluded to the fact that the sort of benefits that are provided by Ms. Chris' company and Ms. Frey's company are not necessarily available to everybody, and so you may have employees in different situations. But doesn't this bill provide the sort of flexibility that would allow them to do what they want to do, at the same time not coercing others to do it if they don't want to do it?
Well, I think the FLSA currently provides this flexibility, if you want to call it that, which is that they are currently obligated to provide their employees with overtime pay for overtime hours worked. Those employees can save that money. They can invest it on their own. They can earn interest. Miss Chris' son can put that money in the bank and start to watch the returns on his money
But they
grow.
can't get comp time, and if that's...
But there's nothing preventing, I'm sorry for interrupting,
Go
there's
ahead,
nothing
go ahead.
preventing these employers from saying, you know what, you worked 20 extra hours last week, why don't you take 20 hours this week, or take 10 hours, take the time you need this week to deal with your family situation. We're not going to penalize you for not showing up for work tomorrow.
Let me get
There's
Mr.
nothing that prevents them from doing
Let
that.
me ask Mr. Court to respond to that.
I think the example that's being used is one that is allowed only in the same pay period. So if I work the extra 20 hours a week in the first week of April, and my granddaughter, who happens to be a pretty good tennis player, has a tournament at the end of April, I'm not going to get that 20 hours a week off at the end of April. So the flexibility that's talked about under the current FLSA is very limited to 2-week periods of time. The flexibility under this bill is much different and much more beneficial.
Thank you. Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Szabo, do you care to respond to that, what he just said?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that would prevent the employee from going to their employer in that situation and saying, hey, my daughter has a tennis tournament at the end of April. Can I, thank you for offering me this time off next week, but actually, would you mind if I just waited until the end of the month and took the time then? And an employer that wants to make their employees happy, wants to make sure that their employees' morale is good, will say yes.
Great, thank you. Because the overtime salary threshold under which workers are automatically eligible for overtime pay has not been updated in a very, very long time. Today, it's possible for employers to demand very long hours from many of their employees without paying them a cent for for hours worked beyond 40 hours a week. HR 1180 gives employers yet another tool to deny workers overtime pay at the very moment their overtime rights ought to be strengthened. Ms. Szabo, would you tell this committee about the extent to which the number of employees covered by overtime rules has fallen since the 1970s as a result of the failure to update the threshold?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're talking about the salary rule for overtime.
Yes.
And so back in the 70s, 1975, about 60% of the workforce was covered, was under the salary threshold for being able to earn overtime pay. We're down to 8%. Unfortunately, the rule that would have increased the salary threshold to $47,000 is held up in court. But that is something that we very much want to see increased. It would cover the new rule, if the Obama administration rule were put into effect, would cover around 12.5 million more workers, more than half of whom are women, many of whom are parents.
Well, yeah, in 1979, nearly 12 million salaried workers had overtime protections. But today, with a 50% larger workforce, only 3.5 million salaried workers are automatically protected. So that's a real decline. And that's just stunning to learn that. I have a report here from the Economic Policy Institute that highlights the false choice between flexibility and overtime, and I ask unanimous consent to enter it into the record.
Without objection.
Ms. Szabo, by making overtime cheaper, wouldn't H.R. 1180 incentivize employers to assign mandatory overtime rather than letting employees go home to their families?
I'm afraid that it would. I mean, if you think about, say you have 6 employees that are all cashiers. Some of them choose to accept comp time. Some of them want their overtime pay because they need to pay the bills. The implicit incentive for that employer is to award the overtime hours to the workers that are planning to use comp time, which means they're getting more labor from those folks. It also means less hours for those other workers who very much are relying on their overtime pay to make ends meet.
For people with family commitments, being forced to stay late at work can mean children do not get picked up from a child care center or met at the bus stop. Would you tell us about the extent to which workers are already being forced to work mandatory overtime and its impact on their lives?
Yeah, so there's some really great research based on national survey data that anybody can get access to that asks about required overtime. About more than a quarter of workers that are forced to work overtime now or asked to work overtime are being forced to work overtime by their employers. That's a lot of people who don't have any say over their schedules, who aren't able to meet those obligations. And in an economy that is still needing to produce more jobs and better quality jobs, the incentive to offer overtime and to take overtime is pretty great for folks. The other thing, just to link to your prior question, there's also research showing that folks that are just above that $23,000 salary threshold are more likely to be asked to work overtime. They're also less likely to have control over starting and working hours or other sort of pieces of flexibility that allow them to make their lives work and to have control.
Well, so is this legislation likely to make this problem worse?
Yeah, I absolutely believe that for many, many, many workers, the Working Family Flexibility Act would make lives worse. It would give them less control, less wages, and a lot more uncertainty.
So really what we're talking about here is less choices for workers and more leverage for the employers, more convenience for the employers. Because as I said in my opening statement, I don't believe there's anything as convenient or as fungible as cash. And that actually, we're taking that fungibility, that convenience away from employees. So thank you for your testimony. I appreciate it. I yield back.
Chair now calls on the distinguished ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this bill really purports to provide flexibility for workers, but in reality, the only real flexibility is for employers. It provides employers with flexibility to avoid paying time and a half for overtime that the Fair Labor Standards Act requires. By making overtime hours cheaper, H.R. 1180 would create a perverse incentive for employers to encourage their employees to work excessive hours. And let me ask Ms. Szabo a couple of questions. Is there any prohibition against an employer choosing employees for overtime that would accept comp time rather than overtime?
No, sir.
You had talked about kind of the real choice, and if you don't change the law, there's nothing in present law to prevent someone from working overtime, getting paid time and a half, and then subsequently using that, just taking those hours off with an agreement with the employer. How would that work? And is that different from present law?
Well, so under current law, an employee could work overtime. Say there's a factory that needs to meet a demand they're a subcontractor and they need to meet a demand. I know in Alabama there's a lot of car manufacturers that then have car suppliers, and they have their employees working 12-hour shifts for 7 days to meet demand. Those employees would be paid for their time, and if the employer wants to make sure that their employees are having the time they need with their family, there's nothing preventing them in current law from giving those employees time off, whether that's paid or unpaid time off. There's nothing that prevents them under current law from allowing their employees to shift their start or end times, or to work a split shift, or to work four 10-hour days instead of 8 5-hour days. Nothing at all. The current law already provides that flexibility.
But if they took time off, say they worked 4 hours, got time and a half, got 6 hours, and then a few weeks later took 6 weeks off, they would lose 6 hours off, they would lose pay for that 6 hours. And essentially, they'd be right back where the bill would put you.
Right, that's correct.
And that would be really a choice of the employee, not of the employer. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
A suggestion was made that when the employee selects the time for the comp time and is unreasonably delayed, that all they have to do is to file a lawsuit. Can you say a word about how practical that is as a remedy?
Sure. I mean, we already know a couple of things. One, filing litigation is a pretty onerous task, particularly for a worker who doesn't have a lot of leverage in their workplace, who doesn't have any protections against being fired other than, anti-retaliation language that exists in current law. But pursuing a lawsuit for something like this is very difficult. We already know that there are vast wage and hour division violations, wage and hour law violations. DOL is pursuing those. But I'm very worried that under, the president's budget, DOL is seeing a 21% decrease in their budget if the president's budget is approved. There are no administrative remedies in this bill. There are very few worker protections, and I worry in that situation that you've just described that workers will really be left on their own without much power and without the ability to recover the wages that they're owed.
So after an employer says no, the attorney's fees for the lawsuit would probably exceed whatever you would get. Is that right?
Yeah, I would imagine so. I mean, I think, a good illustration of this is say, that a woman works several extra hours, earns overtime pay. Her mother is then, and she has banked it as comp time under this proposal. Her mother then needs surgery, and she asks her employer to use her banked comp time so that she can be there with her mother at surgery. Now, the case law from the public sector would say, in some cases, you don't actually get to take your time on the day that you want it if it will disrupt the employer's operation. The employer just needs to give you that time within a reasonable period. So say that you want your day on Tuesday so you can be with your mother, but your employer says, Tuesdays are really not a good day. We have a big demand and I'm not going to be able to fill that. Why don't you take Thursday instead? That leaves the person both with the inability to be there with her mother, but also without the ability to get those wages to pay a caregiver to be there with her mother at that time. In that case, she has really nothing of value at the moment that she needs it, whereas something like the Healthy Families Act would provide an earned paid sick day at that same time.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent that a letter from ASCME be entered in the record in opposition to the bill.
That objection so ordered. Chair now recognizes the distinguished chairwoman of the full committee, the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Dr. Fox.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Frey, Continental Realty Corporation seems to be doing all the right things when it comes to implementing workplace flexibility practices. Contrary to what some of my Democrat colleagues claim, by and large, I think most employers do the right thing by employees. You're pretty clear about the need for policies to encourage or allow employers to offer voluntary options, and that includes having a voluntary approach to comp time. Can you elaborate on why it's so important for policymakers to avoid crafting one-size-fits-all requirements for employers with respect to flexible work options?
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. So with the one-size-fits-all mandate, unfortunately, all employers and all workplaces are not the same. I can draw from my own experience that competition for top talent is fierce, especially here in the DC, Metro DC area. And really having the flexibility to be able to maintain, retain, and keep our top talent is extremely important to us. It's far less disruptive to provide something like that rather than to lose some of the people that we consider high performers that we need to keep and retain and develop. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Christ, you described several flexible arrangements for workers at Wellstone. How would offering comp time option enhance your ability to provide employees the personalized work options many of them are seeking, and would comp time fit well with the other flexible work arrangements you offer?
Thank you very much. Yes, having comp time would actually be another asset for our employees. We do compressed work weeks. We have flexible schedules, but also in our group homes, our employees can work with other employees to swap shifts. But that still doesn't take into effect if they want leave 3 months from now to take a family vacation. Although we do provide generous leave policies, if they don't have enough leave to cover it, they're going to be in leave without pay. We're going to allow them to be off. But if they chose to save their comp time or their overtime and just convert it to comp time, that would be their choice. And so I think that's why I advocate for our employees, because although we do offer generous leave and flexible schedules, This is just another addendum or another option for them.
Right. By the way, I want to thank all of you all for being here today. Mr. Court, I think the arguments you've made for this legislation are excellent. Do you know any reason why private sector workers shouldn't have the same opportunities and choices in workplace afforded to public sector workers?
I do not.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'll just make one quick comment. I don't understand why it is better for people who work in the public sector to have this option and other people not to have it. We often get accused of the laws not applying to us that apply to everybody else. I think it's time that we outlined the benefits that public service employees get that the private sector is not allowed to have. I just don't think most of the public understands this. As Ms. Christ outlined in her comments, she has to explain to the employees there that public sector people can get this, but private sector people can't because of federal legislation. It just doesn't make any sense. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate it. And to our distinguished chairwoman, I believe most employers try to do what's right. I don't think there's any real distinction on that, but obviously there are employers that don't. And what we're trying to look at here is a win for both employer and employee. A happy employee makes for a better workplace, generally more profitable or more productive. So following that, when I first started my career, I was a single dad. And in this case of comp time, if I worked the first 8 or 10 weeks of the year, an extra 5 or 10 hours a day, that's great. I build up this comp time if I wanted that. The difference is if I wanted it in my paycheck, I wouldn't have any choice in that under this bill that we're looking at today, correct? Ms. Christie? You wouldn't have the choice whether you want comp time or overtime, correct? The employee?
With HR 1180, if you went into a written agreement with your employer saying, I would prefer the comp time instead of overtime, you would have that choice.
Now, but let me be very specific here. The employee doesn't have that choice unless they sign off on it. You would, as the employer, could make that employee take comp time versus overtime, correct?
We would make them take the overtime. If that employee did not choose comp time, if we offered
That's
it.
what you do, but under the law, if this bill were to pass, you would have the ability to impose comp time, correct?
No,
That's not correct?
that is not correct, sir.
Okay, then maybe I got some different information.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So the plain language of the statute, of the bill, says that there has to be a written agreement between an employer and an employee for the employee to accept and for the employer to provide comp time in lieu of overtime pay. And in your situation, I don't know what job you had at the time. Perhaps you had leverage. Perhaps you were a unique employee and your employer wanted to make you happy and they would give you whichever of those two you wanted. I think the concern is that where there are hourly workers, where there are workers who are really, for all purposes, interchangeable in terms of their ability to do the job, the preference that an employer would have, whether knowingly or implicitly, would be to give the employees who would bank comp time the overtime hours rather than giving the overtime pay in the current pay period to the employees that wanted the overtime pay.
So compare that, what we're talking about today, as to the existing law for public employees, and give me some of the differences.
So public employees, in 1985, the Supreme Court ruled in the Garcia case that the Fair Labor Standards Act applied to public employees in states and localities were employers for the purposes of the Fair Labor Standards Act. That was counter to a lot of the ways that public employers had been operating, and they had been providing comp time already. And they were very, very worried. The National Association of Counties and the League of Cities were really worried that this was going to create very tight budgets as especially their emergency workers were working overtime hours. And so Congress and President Reagan crafted an exception for public employees so that they would be able to receive comp time in lieu of overtime pay, which had been the practice up to that point. But there are very real differences between public employers and private employers. There's a profit motive in the private sector that doesn't exist in the public sector. There are often due process protections for public sector employees, whether outright or through collective bargaining agreements. There are less likelihood, not so much anymore, but less likelihood that employers will go bankrupt or go out of business, leaving their employees holding the bag for unpaid comp time, which can influence their ability to receive unemployment insurance. There are a lot of differences that make these two situations quite inapposite to each other.
But under this provision, you wouldn't have to pay that if they chose to not take the comp time and take the overtime. You wouldn't have to pay that to the following year. Is that correct?
So it would depend.
By the end of January the following year?
It would depend on if the employee wanted to use their comp time and the employer agreed that they could use their comp time, they would receive the comp time and they would be paid when they use the comp time. For an employee who has banked their comp time,
Yes.
the bill would allow the employer to hold on to the value of that banked comp time until January 31st of the next year.
So that income would be deferred to the next year, is that correct?
It would be an interest-free loan to employers until the next year. When they
It
have to
would be
cash
on next year's income, not on the year they earned it.
Correct.
So they get to defer that to the second. Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the distinguished Mr. Ferguson from Georgia. Mr. Ferguson, one of our new members. We welcome you and recognize you for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Byrne. I appreciate it. And thanks to each of you for taking time to be here. It's interesting listening to the banter back and forth, and there seems to be many times an assumption that employers are the bad guys and they're going to purposely try to box their employees out or do harm to their employees. One of the things I'd like Ms. Chris and Ms. Frey, if y'all would speak to this, as a small business owner myself, I tried to provide as many flexible options as I could to my employees. It's something that they wanted. We are entering a period of economic growth right now. We are going to have a real challenge with skilled employees and recruiting those skilled employees. Tell us how this would help you in recruitment of employees in a 21st century economy, and how your employees would want this as an option.
Excuse me, sir. We have workers that deal with mental illness, of course, 24/7, strong behaviors, and they're highly trained. We train them, but we want to keep them. And so in order to keep them, to reduce turnover, we have to be flexible and offer creative solutions to them in order to help that work-life balance. And so being a nonprofit, our pay scales aren't high. But our benefits and flexibility to promote our workforce culture of caring is foremost. And so this bill would definitely help in our cause for recruitment and retention.
Thank you for asking. When we collective solutions together, and I find
is their greatest asset, and it's the thing that we've got to be innovative in this nation and in this 21st century economy. I think we've got to stay away from the view that business is there to punish or to hurt employees. We want our employees happy. We want them productive. It is one of the greatest things that we can do as employers is to make sure that we have a healthy, happy, functioning workforce that operates at a high level. So, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ferguson. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Shea Porter.
Thank you all for being here. And it's a very interesting discussion for me because I was raised by parents who each had small businesses. I was an essential part of their labor force, unprotected, it's a family, but we grew things together. So I do understand what it's like when somebody doesn't show up or the stresses and strains on small businesses. However, I also worked in a number of jobs that were not glamorous when I was going through school, including factories and restaurants and as a chambermaid. And yeah, I was exploited there. And, you know, I had some great employers and I had some that were just awful, and we felt like there were no protection. So I think what we're talking about is a country that has, you know, mixed businesses and attitudes towards the employer and attitudes towards the employee. So I believe our goal here is to try to protect everybody here. So I just have a couple of yes or no questions that I would like answered by each one of you, please. And it's just yes or no. Employers cannot count on using time when they actually need it. So employees can't necessarily save up for, say, a birth or a surgery. Yes?
No, ma'am.
They can count on using that time. You believe under this bill they can count on using that time, guaranteed the time that they need, the date they need?
Yes, ma'am. For my organization,
No, I'm talking about under this bill.
in this bill, yes, ma'am, unless it unduly disrupts business operations.
Okay, well, see, that's an important part, because babies always disrupt. They arrive at a certain time. And so I just wanted to get that from you, and each one of you, please.
I would agree. I do not think it does, I believe employees can use the time when they need it.
Okay, that's not how the bill is written, but, and,
No, they can't use the time when they need it as an absolute guarantee under this bill.
right. Mr. Court?
Yes, they can, subject to the unduly restrictive test on
Well,
the
it's that
employee.
subject part that's really always difficult, isn't it? Because what happens is, I know from the small businesses, there was never a good time for anybody not to show up, you know, for my parents' work. So I get that. But the reality is that they can't be certain they're going to get it. Second question, employer can cash out. So if the employee was saving it for a birth or a vacation or a school break or whatever, they could lose it, right? They could, because the employer can decide after 80 hours to say, I'm not going to do the comp time.
Yes, with notice
Okay,
to the
but-
employee.
But the point is that if I'm saving for, say, a birth, then the notice isn't going to change my circumstances. So yes, no?
Yes, with notice, and they would receive the compensation at time and a half.
Okay, again, so I'm saving for a birth of a baby, and the employer can come to me and say, sorry, you're not going to get paid because it's not good for the business at this time. And it may be legitimate in terms of the business schedule, but I'm just talking about there's no ironclad guarantees. So, Ms. Shabo?
There's no guarantee.
Mr. Court?
The employer can cash out in excess of 80 hours. You are guaranteed, you would still have the 80 hours comp time pay.
But that, no, my understanding is they can cash out. The employer can then opt to, say, I've decided not to do the comp time. So I've checked this, but Ms. Shaba, is that your understanding as well?
That's my understanding too, yes.
And that is mine, and I have checked it. So how about a compromise? If they held the money, if the company held the money for 80 hours, say, and then decide to cash out, right, for the employee, because that could extend over many months, then would anybody be willing to pay interest on the money that they held that belonged to the employee if the employer was the one who changed the deal? So if the employer says after 80 hours, I'm not going to give you comp time, I've decided that I'd rather cash out, do you think it'd be fair to pay the employee interest for the money that they held during that time? Because it is holding hours.
I think that's something that I would need to study in more detail.
Okay, because we want to be fair here. The other part is, could we say to a company that you have to guarantee that at least 75% of the requests you honor in terms of the scheduling? In other words, they can't have a 100% record of saying, no, that's inconvenient, and we could just maybe set a time that the company has to honor 75% of the requests, understanding that 25% you have to be flexible for a business, just so we know that they're adhering to the spirit of the rule as well as, you know, the actual rule. Would that go well with everybody here?
Mr. Court, if you have an answer, if you could give it very quickly, because we're getting out of time here.
I'm not in favor of a hard percentage limit. I think the unduly burdensome test and the 20 years of history we have in the public sector says that works well enough right now.
Okay, so, but you would be okay if they did set a test to make sure that companies were adhering most of the time to the request for comp time?
The gentlewoman's time has expired. I'm going to allow the witness to answer very quickly.
Okay, thank you.
No, that's not what I meant to imply. I think the current test in the bill is good enough.
All right, thank you. I yield
Gentlewoman's
back.
time has expired. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Stefanik, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Christ, I noticed in your testimony that a majority of Wellstone's employees are women and many are younger workers. Based on your experience with that workforce, how important are flexible work arrangements to employees, and do younger workers have different priorities than older workers?
Thank you for your question. Our workforce, with the women as a majority, it's very essential that they have time off, especially because many of our employees are single parents. And so they take care of not only maybe their own children, but also their other family members, maybe parents, elderly parents, or extended family. And so it would be important. Our younger workers, they have many times different needs, but one of the things I've noticed with our workers, they like the flexibility. They want it in their hands. They don't want to be in a box and contained to an 8 to 5. So it's nice to be flexible and give them the choice.
Thank you, and I think it's important to note that with technology and iPhones, we're in a 21st century workforce, and you talked about the demographics at Wellstones. I think that's representative of much of the changing demographics. There are 14 million single parents are in the workplace, and 85% of workers value workplace flexibility when considering a new job. This is a good thing, providing more balance and flexibility. So thank you for your answers, and I would like to yield the balance of my time to the chairman.
Mr. Bonnick. Mr. Court, let me ask you a follow-up question. What is the remedy that an employee has against an employer if he or she is not compensated for accrued comp time? And is that different from the remedy which he or she would have when an employee's got a claim for unpaid wages?
Mr. Chairman, it is the same remedy under the Fair Labor Standards Act. You not only get the value of what you have lost, but twice that much liquidated damages if it is considered to be willful. And to address Representative Scott's concern concerning attorney's fees eating up that award, if the company loses, they pay the attorney's fees for the employee under the Fair Labor Standards Act. In addition, since this is a bill that falls under the jurisdiction of the Department of Labor, you may not have to bring a lawsuit. You may be able to file a charge with the Department of Labor, who could investigate as they do other wage and hour claims, and that doesn't cost you a dime.
Back to you, Mr. Court. The opponents of this bill suggested, in previous debates at least, that the bill would encourage employers to demand excessive hours by making overtime less expensive, thus undermining the 40-hour work week's protections against excessive hours. Will this bill reduce overtime costs for employers? In other words, does comp time allow an employer to avoid paying overtime premiums?
The comp time certainly does not allow the employer to avoid paying the overtime premiums, and as I said in response to an earlier question, it in fact could increase the cost if the individual receives a pay raise over the course of the year after they've already banked the comp time.
One of the things that I'm hearing is that there's some incentive in this bill for employers to essentially game the system and take advantage of employees to rob them of either their pay or their accrued comp time. Is that possible under the bill, that an employer could do that and there not be some remedy by the employee against that?
No, Mr. Chairman, it is not. The bill very specifically has remedies, has prohibitions against coercion, threatening employees. So the employee is going to get the benefit of the paycheck if they want it, because they're not forced to enter the program. Or if they want to bank the comp time, then they have the guarantee of the ability to use it, unlike the example that Ms. Szabo was giving, where you're depending upon the employer to agree to let you have time off. This is a right you would have under the statute.
As one lawyer to another, who I haven't had defended these before, if you get one of these things either from an employer or from the Department of Labor, it is no fun. There is every incentive of the world to avoid having anything close to this. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Desaigner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to follow a couple of comments, as having spent 35 years as an owner and manager of restaurants, that most employers want to do the right thing. But the framework for doing the right thing is part of what we're talking about here. And it sounds as if, from all of the employer representative witnesses, that this is a zero-sum game from your viewpoint for the employees. Is that the way you look at it? That if they take the comp time, it's zero-sum for them?
If they choose the comp time, they're still going to get that time and a half, which is really paid leave or paid time off. Same as if they chose to get the overtime, sir.
Okay. Is that the way you view it, Ms. Frey?
I would agree with Ms. Christ. I think that it's a choice on the part of the employee, and it's a choice that they can make, and they can elect by agreement, and they can also opt out of the agreement at any time.
Mr. Court?
Yes, I would agree with the two previous witnesses' answers. Plus, I think our experience in the public sector, where we've had this for a long time, would tend to indicate that.
And Ms. Szabo, I want to go to you on that, because some of the confusion that I'm still trying to figure out with your response and Ms. Christ's response is that they take the comp time, but they don't get paid for some indeterminate period of time. So in California, you're required the rule used to be you had 5 working days to pay your employees. I was required to do that, including their time and a half. So if my employees decided to do comp time, when do they get compensated for that time and a half? Is it 5 days after the work period in their paycheck, or is it a year from then?
So for the comp time, they would take the comp time when their employer allows them, when they request it and their employer allows them to take it. If they want to cash out for the value of their comp time, it would be within 30 days of their request, or if they don't make a request and it's still on the employer's books, the 31st of January of the next year.
So it's not a zero-sum game to the employee?
No, the value of the employee's wages is sitting with the employer for some
Right.
period of time until they take the time. I think the other thing that's missing in this conversation, if I can just interject, is that we're talking about a very small segment of the workforce that's actually working more than 40 hours a week to be able to even get the value of this time. Often we're looking at people who have too few hours and also don't have any paid leave. And so I don't think it's reasonable to think about these two proposals, the Working Families Flexibility Act or something like the Healthy Families Act, which provides paid sick days, which you have in California and in Oregon, or paid family leave, which you have in California and in several other states. Those are things that are guaranteed for people who need the time, no matter how many hours they're working or who they're working for. Whereas this bill really only applies to a narrow slice of folks and only to those employees lucky enough to work for fair employers, like it sounds like you all are, who will administer this new comp time benefit fairly.
So in California, we have those benefits, as you say, provided by law, but we also protect the 8-hour workday. In addition to the 40-hour workday, we had many hearings when I was in the legislature about changing the flexible work permits. Employers can easily do that by a majority vote of their employees. I think the threshold is like 5 employees, so it captures most of the workforce. We want that in California because of the social model, the pressures on families, long commutes, but we want to make sure the base level's paid, and it's a zero-sum game. So I did it both ways, and I always struggle with this, and the chairman has heard me before. Coming from a high cost of doing business area as a business person, you want to lift all boats. So while I agree we should have flexibility, it sometimes drove me crazy as a restaurant owner in California that I had to pay time and a half for split shifts, which required my employees sometimes to drive a long time back and forth. But it was fine with me as long as all my competitors had to do the same thing. So I struggle with the hollowing out of the American middle class, not to blame this law for that, but as a potential contributor to that if it's going to be innovative and it's zero-sum, it really is zero-sum. And the last point, the enforcement mechanism. I'm one who believes that private rights of action is not the most effective. As the chairman said, nobody likes a visit from regulators. However, it can be much more efficient. So, Ms. Szabo, could you talk about that a little bit, both from the employer and the employee's standpoint, about the mechanism to enforce this small percentage of people who would actually choose this?
Sure. I mean, the law provides a private right of action, as you've said. I don't read it as providing a particularly good administrative remedy for folks here, if any administrative remedy at all. And I think it's important to look at wage and hour violations, which have increased, to the tunes of millions of dollars, including in the districts of folks that are sitting here today. I don't think that we want to increase the litigation here, but what we are potentially setting up through this so-called Working Families Flexibility Act is actually increasing uncertainty about what employees must have, what employers must do, and the real potential for a lot more disputes about what money is owed to whom and when.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to join your subcommittee. Really appreciate the conversation. Ms. Szabo, there's been a suggestion that this bill, H.R. 1180, is needed so that employers can provide flexibility, but is there anything in the Fair Labor Standards Act right now that prevents employers from providing flexibility now through, for example, paid or unpaid leave or flexible, predictable schedules without giving up their right to overtime pay?
No, there's not.
Thank you. And I agree with my colleague from California. There's a lot of people now who are facing a great deal of economic insecurity and anxiety. There's people who are worried about whether they can pay their rent or find housing, healthcare costs, balancing family responsibilities, saving for retirement, saving for kids to go to college, the whole long list. And people are concerned that maybe their kids won't have the same opportunities they had. And we're seeing that across the country, people working longer hours, sometimes more than one job. And our workforce also looks drastically different than it did, say, 50 years ago. The Democrats have put forth a working families agenda, several pieces of legislation that would keep workers in the workforce, provide the scheduling flexibility, which there's a lot of technology that helps with that, as we know, allow workers to care for themselves and their families, and raise stagnant wages. And as you mentioned, the Oregon legislature recently not only passed paid 6 days policy, but also increased the minimum wage. We have a tiered system, depends on urban areas, rural areas. But they're currently also debating legislation to create paid family leave, like most of the rest of the world provides. So can you talk about how these types of workplace policies affect workforce participation and our country's economic prosperity, and how would this bill, H.R. 1180, affect our sort of larger goal of preparing a workforce to meet the 21st century economy? And I do want to mention, because Ms. Shea Porter mentioned, and others have mentioned, small businesses. I've met with many small businesses in Oregon who are providing these policies, and they're finding that not only do they have a happier, healthier workforce, they also have less challenge with recruitment and great retention, because they found that if they provide these policies to their workforce, they stay, they're happier, and these are small businesses. People are concerned that this doesn't work with small businesses, but we have many examples that show that it does.
That's right, and thank you for your question. Actually, one of the arguments that's often used is some of what's come up here, which is that it should be up to employers to decide what they want to do because it makes for better recruitment and retention, and it gives them a leg up. What we actually find when we look at the data is that small businesses, a study commissioned by Small Business Majority that was released just last week, shows that 70% of businesses nationwide, this is based on a scientific sample of small businesses, support the Family Act, which would create a national paid family and medical leave standard. 70%. And most of that sample was not Democrats, it was Republicans and independents. Across the board with the public, Close to 80% of people support a national paid family and medical leave insurance program, similar to what exists in California, New Jersey, Rhode Island, maybe soon in Oregon, certainly soon in New York and here in D.C.
And basically every other industrialized country.
And we have an opportunity here in the U.S. to leapfrog in some ways some of those other countries by creating a leave that is of a reasonable length, that has adequate wage replacement, that applies equally to women and men, and for all purposes, not just parental leave, but also to address the explosion in the aging of the population and elder care. We know that when workers have paid family leave, women in particular, they are more likely to return to work within a year of giving birth. They are likely to earn higher wages. They are less likely to rely on programs like public assistance and food stamps. Same with new dads. Women and men are both more likely to have hundreds of thousands of dollars of additional income and retirement savings when they're able to take.
And I don't mean to interrupt, but I also want to ask, yesterday was Equal Pay Day, so I want to ask about that too, because this is was the day when women's wages finally catch up with what men made last year. So the Paycheck Fairness Act would put some teeth into that and strengthen that. What would this bill, HR 1180, do for women in equal pay?
I mean, at best, nothing. At worst, it would create a pay cut, and we know that 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women. Vast majority of tipped workers are women, and this does nothing to raise wages for folks. In fact, it takes money out of workers' pockets at the time when they need it most.
Well, and when we look at the challenges facing workers right now, this is the wrong direction. And I just wanted to also mention that, because we're talking about family leave, about 25% of women go back to work within 2 weeks of having a child in this country. And for those of us who have had children, we know how challenging that must be. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
A couple questions here. I'll start off by Ms. Frey. There's an article, I don't know if it's been referred to yet, in the National Review, kind of talking about the difference of who's on the side of the worker, who's not here. National Review's assessment is that the Republicans are in favor of giving workers an option of doing whatever they want with their overtime pay, and the Democrats oppose it. Do you agree with that assessment, that the Republicans are kind of more in favor of freedom and allowing people to do what they want, as opposed to the Democrats are saying you have to use your overtime this way?
Honestly, sir, I couldn't answer that. I could only answer what our organization would be in favor of, which would be certainly giving employees the option to make those choices, whether to receive that compensation as overtime pay at the time or to use comp time.
Okay. I'll ask Ms. Szabo a question kind of along the same lines. I recently ran into an employer who, to his surprise, it wasn't a minimum wage employer, but he was trying to find a way to incentivize his employees to be more productive in a factory. And to his surprise, his employees preferred getting another 3 or 4 hours off rather than a cash bonus. Something that was a surprise to him because he felt clearly he would have taken the cash if he was in their position. But it does show us particularly many young people today would rather have Friday off or Friday afternoon off or something like that. Now in the mix, we put a situation in which some women don't maybe consider money as important and would rather have the time off to spend with their children or family. Don't you feel it's a little bit philosophically wrong, and following up on your last answer here, philosophically wrong to tell that woman or man that you don't have a choice in the matter, that if you accumulate overtime, you have to use it, you have to take the money. The money should be the most important thing for you, and if you would rather have another, 120 hours a week or 20 hours a year, off to spend with your children, that's against the law. Don't you feel it's wrong for you to put yourself in the position of the employee and tell them that they have to value money more?
But in your hypothetical, there's nothing that's stopping that worker from going to her employer and saying, I'd really like to take a month off. And, I've earned the overtime pay. I'm putting it in the bank. I have got money saved up to go take my vacation. May I please have some extra time off? And if that employer values the employee and wants the employee to be happy, they will say yes, as long as it doesn't, if they want to, they will say yes. And the employee can use their bargaining power if they have it to be able to ask for that time off. But what most people, I don't think all employers are bad at all. I just moderated a really excellent roundtable of employers last week out in California who all had different practices and all had similar philosophies about doing the right thing for their employees. But what we're talking about here is putting employees in a situation where maybe they don't have the ability to leverage that time off later. They need the value of their wages, and what we're doing here is providing an out for employers who don't want to take the high road to pay their employees the money that they're owed at the time that they are owed it.
Well, what we're doing here is creating flexibility, and I think the whole purpose of the Fair Labor Standards Act is put together by people who don't necessarily trust employers to do the best thing for their employees. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the law in the first place. I think what it does is it forces employers to give employees an option. And I think a lot of employees, if my experience talking to employers is any indication, value that time off. They value that family time. And you're creating a situation here in which, in some cases, the employees who bank that money are forbidden from using that time with their family and have to take the cash, which you kind of implied in your response with Congresswoman before, and that, you know, there are unquestionably some women who are going to say, I don't mind if I don't make any more money. I'd rather take the time off. Now, at the end of the year, when the professors do the study, it may show that women aren't making as much money at that company because they've opted to take the time off. But is it up to us to weigh in and say that you can't value your family more than additional cash?
But in that case, that woman would already have worked extra hours away from her family to be able to even have the option of having comp time or overtime. So I guess I'm not sure I'm following the hypothetical.
There may be times where you want more family time than other time. Okay, maybe that person could be a man too, depending upon when his spouse works. You know, he'd rather or she'd rather spend time with their children than have an outside caregiver, that sort of thing.
Sure.
Or maybe they have another child, a younger child, and they want to spend time with the younger child. It seems to me that rather having us people in Washington tell them what's best for them, wouldn't it be better to allow the employee to determine what is in their own best interest and best interest of their family? It is true that some people are not, if they don't have this option, are just going to keep working and earn more money. And for people who think the be-all and end-all in life is how much money you make, and we have to worship at those statistics, saying that you have a more satisfactory life if you're making more money, I can see why they'd oppose this bill. But for those of us who, don't think the most important thing in life is how much money you're making, why don't you allow them that option if the employer won't?
Ms. Szabo, his time has expired, but I'm going to give you a chance to very quickly respond to that.
Sure. I mean, I think my basic answer is if an employee is in the situation where they want that time, there's nothing that is preventing them from asking their employer for giving them that time now. What this is, and in terms of people building up as much money, I think about the 30 million women who are heading households that live in poverty right now, who need those wages.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I would like to thank our witnesses for taking the time to testify before the subcommittee today. That's the end of your testimony. I am going to turn now to Mr. Decano to ask if he has any closing remarks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say that in response, I still say there's nothing as convenient or as fungible as cash. And that leverage really should be left to the employee as far as cash or time. I want to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony today. It's clear from this hearing that what I would like to call the Betrayal of Working Families Act provides employers with the flexibility to deny workers their overtime pay while giving employees nothing in return, really. We heard that employers can unilaterally decide that they don't want to allow employees to take comp time they've earned and cash them out instead, scuttling the doctor's appointment, recovery from surgery, or elder care that the employee might have planned. We heard that the Betrayal of Working Families Act would make it more likely that employers would force employees to work longer hours and deprive them of time and a half pay for doing so. Workers desperately need more time with their families and more money. Today, most low-wage workers don't have access to a single paid sick day. And far too many workers earn poverty-level wages since Congress hasn't raised the minimum wage in nearly a decade. This legislation plays a cruel trick on cash-strapped and time-strapped workers by forcing them to give up time with their families and pay in exchange for the hope that they might eventually be able to take a day off if it's convenient to their employer. This really is about more leverage for the employer, not convenience for the employee. H.R. 1180 is entirely consistent with congressional Republicans' agenda to rig the rules of our economy in favor of special interests and against everyday Americans. In the first 2 months of the 115th Congress, House Republicans filed 40 Congressional Review Act joint resolutions of disapproval to roll back rules designed to make Americans safe on the job, prevent discrimination, ensure educational equity, and clean air and clean water. The President has already signed many of these into law. This betrayal of working families has got to stop. Congressional Republicans should not be trying to hoodwink working families into handing over their overtime pay. The American people deserve real solutions they can count on. They need paid sick days and family leave and strengthened rights to overtime pay. The pretty packaging of this legislation as so-called flexibility for working families should fool no one. This is just another attempt to take money out of workers' paychecks. And we should reject this once and for all. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cano. This law, the Fair Labor Standards Act, was passed in the 1930s. Let's think back and remember what the workplace of the 1930s looked like. First of all, the vast majority of mothers with children under 18 weren't in the workplace. Today, it's almost 71%. Now, one of those women in the workplace in the 1930s was my grandmother, because my grandfather had been killed and she had to work. She had the typical job of the time, it was an 8-to-5 job. So she wasn't there in the afternoons when my mother or my uncles had things at school. My Uncle Bill had a severe disease that affected his legs, that eventually crippled him. There were times where she would have to take off work and her employer would work with her, but it was tough on her to be able to be there for his treatments. Now, we have nearly 3/4 of our mothers in the workplace. And for them, money's not a good substitute for being there with the kids. Whether it's a school play, whether it's an athletic event, whether it's a school trip, or whether they have somebody sick or who's got a serious injury or illness like my Uncle Bill. So the whole idea is we're going to try to get federal law in sync with what's really happening in the real lives of American workers. And Ms. Kristen, Ms. Frey told us what the real lives of American workers are like. And a lot of them want that freedom to be able to trade out and get that comp time so they can go on that field trip 2 months down the road. Or they know that they've got a cancer treatment with an elderly parent that's coming up and they need to be able to bank that time to be with them. Or to do a myriad of other things that are impinging upon their lives. And so all this is trying to do is to give them that flexibility, give them that option, which is just in keeping with what the new workplace looks like. I was sitting there watching Ms. Stefanik. She pulled out her cell phone. There's more computing power in that cell phone than there were in this whole building worth of computers when I was coming through college 40 years ago. And we can do so much more from our homes and other places to be able to make work work. Now, I know that there are some concerns that there are some bad actors out there in the private sector. They're going to take this law and do bad things to people. Well, first of all, I think that that is an absolutely inaccurate presumption. Most employers are just exactly like Ms. Chris and Ms. Frey here. They're looking for ways to give their employees a better workplace. But if there are bad actors out here, here's what the law says, the bill says, under remedies. It says an employer that violates Section 7A4 shall be liable to the employee affected in the amount of the rate of compensation for each hour of compensatory time accrued by the employee and in an additional equal amount as liquidated damages, so it's twice, and attorney's fees. Now, if you're an employer and you've got any sense about you, that's not a very good economic decision. And you can't just sit there and bank on, well, they're not going to want to bring this action. I think anybody with any common sense in business is going to presume that that's going to happen. and they're not going to make that economic decision. That's why it's put in here that it's twice the amount of pay plus attorney's fees. And by the way, I don't mean this in any way derogatory to you, Mr. Court, or to me when I was a labor attorney, those attorney's fees can be substantial. They're almost as big a reason not to do it as anything else here. So the remedies provided in here are pretty good. They're pretty effective in telling an employer, don't violate the protections of this law to keep employees from being taken advantage of here. So I really appreciate the testimony we've had today. It has fleshed out a lot of good issues. There was good back and forth. I think we know what some points and counterpoints are. That will inform other members of this committee when this bill comes up for markup in the full committee. It'll inform the entire House when it comes before the House. But I do think there's one thing we can all agree upon. We should be doing everything we can to help those working mothers, those working dads, and other people have the sort of flexibility that we can provide them in the workplace of the 21st century. But maybe it's time to get away from a 1930s law to do that. Thank you very much. This hearing is adjourned.